Thanks, Joanna. And yes, so as Joanna was saying, my main field of research for a long time has been neuroimaging research, and basically sort of by chance, I got into looking at sex and gender differences some years ago, because I realized that a newspaper article in Denmark was filled with errors. So I wrote a letter of response to the newspaper, and the journalist got very upset and told me that I should take my criticism to the scientific world rather than to the newspaper, because she had just quoted what some other researcher had said. And I have back then said, no, I don't have time for that. But then a couple of other projects didn't materialize, and I had to publish something. So I decided to write a review paper on the brain and language and gender, which was published in 2009, I think it was. And then I thought, then for some years I was reviewing papers on every paper on sex and gender difference, basically, and they were all crap. So I thought, I'll never work on this again, because everybody that has a data set which has no results will throw in a gender variable in their analysis, and then sometimes some random effects will show up. So my take on this for many years has been, due to my knowledge of neuroimaging, that it's very difficult actually to find robust effects in between the genders. I should also say that I've started using sex and gender interchangingly, and when I write it, I always write sex/gender, because when it comes to language, of course, we know that there's really no way that we can disentangle sex and gender. Right, so that's just for the introduction. Let's see if I can change here we go. So you could ask whether it's relevant at all to include sex and gender in language and cognition. Of course, I wouldn't be talking about it if I didn't think it was. But just to also state clearly that I am trying to not fall into the many trenches that are dug all around this field of research. So the take that I've taken on it in the past has been to the one that was also put forward by Hyde in this paper from 2005, that suggested that rather than continuously looking for differences, we should also be looking at similarities. And when she started listing all the things that were similar among men and women, one finds that it's the similarities by far outnumber the differences. And usually the differences, if they're there, they're very small. Speaking of small, I often find it necessary or desirable to give a very short introduction to what it means to be small in terms of statistics. And you probably already know this, so you can take a nap now. But the idea is that when we measure statistical differences, we often do it by means of two group comparisons. At least that's what we do when we talk about sex and gender. And there's this tradition for saying that if you have an effect size, which we often measure with Cohen's d of 0.2, then the difference is small. And you can see here on the figure that means that basically the two distributions are almost entirely overlapping. still there can be a statistically significant difference, but the purple part of the top distribution here is the overlap. And you can see that the two groups here are almost completely overlapping, meaning that that even though there's a difference, it's not very useful. Then if you have what we call a medium difference, which is Cohen's d of 0.5, the distributions move apart just a little bit. That's the middle panel, but they're still highly overlapping. Even what we call a large difference, which is, according to Cohen's tradition, is 0.8 or larger, also has a huge overlap. So even with large effect sizes, there's still a lot of similarity. So we can try to turn this into something else, namely prediction and classification, which I'll be talking about today. So if you have a small or medium or large effect size, what does that mean in terms of using that effect to predict whether the person you are studying is a male or a female? So if we have two distributions like this, then we can make a line down the middle, and then we can use that line to say everything above this line will say is XX, for example, or XY, doesn't really matter, and everything below the mean we'll call the opposite. So now we can start to simulate such data, and then we can see how many percent of a sample are we able to classify correctly with these effect sizes. With a small effect size, you can predict classes with 55% accuracy, 54% accuracy. With the medium effect size, you can predict a class with 60% accuracy, and even with a large effect size, you're still only able to predict, say, gender with 65% accuracy. That means that even things that have a statistically very large difference does not necessarily allow you to say whether the participant you are studying was one or the other sex/gender. So this is something to keep in mind, that these distributions that we're working with, often within cognitive science and language sciences, they often belong in the top small effect size. And this also goes for differences in language acquisition. So here are a plot that I made for a second review paper that I wrote a couple of years ago, where I took data from the so-called MacArthur-Bates word lists, where parents say how many words their children are able to speak at a particular age, and then you can plot that, and these are data from at that time 21 languages, I think it was. And here you can see that if you take the average across all these data points, you find that girls start to speak slightly earlier than boys, and they, across the age bands, these are months of age up until 30 months, they have a slightly larger vocabulary on average. But you can also see that there's a huge variability in all of these dots that I'm plotting here. And if we turn that variability into effect size, we find that the number of words that a girl speaks more than a boy across ages turns out to equate an effect size of approximately 0.2. So that's a small effect size, and it explains only about 1% of the variance. So sex/gender plays a very small role in language acquisition when it comes to competence like this word vocabulary. However, you can find this effect in more or less all the languages that you study. So it seems to be something which is near universal, perhaps. So it's small, but it's there. It doesn't mean anything, but it may actually nevertheless be important. And that is because when you make a cross-section of this, here I've done it for 26 months in figure C. Here you can see that although the differences are small, when you turn to the lower bounds of the distribution, you see that the boys outnumber the girls in large numbers. So suddenly, if you look at the tail of the distribution, the bottom tail where children are in need of help, you see that boys outnumber girls 2 to 1. So suddenly a distribution that doesn't really mean anything actually has a much larger effect when you think about it in terms of diagnosis and language disorders. So developmental language disorders have a similar distribution, the different kinds depending on your definition of language disorder. So there's this interesting paradox here that if you look at the broad distribution, these differences don't really mean anything, and you can't use them to predict the language of a child, cannot really be used to predict whether it's a boy or a girl. But if it's a person with a disorder, then that is most likely a boy. If we then follow the children with different kinds of tests up to around 12 years, we find more or less the same pattern, namely that girls still have a small advantage depending on the test. And again, what we find is that, and the measure, that these effects are small, but they're there. So one thing to think about when we think about this is that vocabulary is related to reading. And so this is what this old paper shows. If you have something like the test recognition, the title recognition test or the author recognition test, that's where you ask participants, give them titles of books or authors, and you ask them whether they're actual authors or whether they're foils. You find that there's a correlation with almost all language variables that you can think of, over and beyond what can be explained by IQ tests such as the Raven's progressive matrices. So reading and in particular reading fiction is something that boosts your language. So language is not only just a cognitive capacity in its own right, it's also the medium for extra learning. So therefore, of course, it's very important. And reading then adds another gear to this, allowing us to learn even more. If we turn to the PISA scores for reading, we find more or less the same pattern, namely that girls outperform boys in all 73 OECD and partner countries. And again, we find here's a slightly larger effect, but still it's sort of in the small to medium range. But there's plenty of evidence that girls read more than boys, and they become better at reading. And the cause and the effect, of course, here is difficult to determine. But again, we find that in the lowest 10th percentile, boys outnumber girls in this roughly 2 to 1 ratio. so that boys are far greater danger of developing dyslexia and similar disorders. So again, when we look at reading, reading is a poor measure if you want to predict sex from a score. But if you look at the lower and upper bounds of the distribution, suddenly the differences become much more pronounced. So it may be worth taking sex and gender into consideration nevertheless. Yeah, so this is a summary of what I've said so far. When looking across the normal population, sex gender is not very predictive for language competences. The small difference in distributions, however, means that boys are much more frequent in the lower bounds. And this leads to an overrepresentation in diagnosis of developmental language disorder, autism spectrum disorder, which also is defined to some extent by language problems. Stuttering is another thing, and dyslexia. Somehow, in the lower bounds, there's just more boys. Okay, so that's the story that I've been telling for 12 years. And then when I was writing this review paper, I came across some other studies that were starting to use not language competence, but language use as something that may or may not have a sex gender component. And it turned out that if you look at Facebook posts of an American sample, then if you have 1,000 words, then you're able to predict sex gender with 80 to 90% accuracy. And this has then been replicated across different languages. Here I've borrowed the data from the SAP et al. Study and created word clouds of the most predictive words for female and male in the American sample. And what you find are things, of course, that relate to the life world of men and women, for better and worse. So you end up with something that is stereotypical of the two genders. Of course, also how we want to present ourselves, because these are social media accounts. So when I was making these word clouds, I said to myself, well, what if we were to take the language tests that children are given, the MacArthur-Bates tests, and try to do the same thing? What would then happen? So the research question that I asked myself together with my colleague Fabio Trecca is that, can we predict sex gender from the words that children use before the age of 3? And is this a better predictor than vocabulary size that we know displays this small effect size? Just to recapitulate what the MacArthur-Bates communicative development inventories is, MBCDI. Well, it's perhaps the most used parental report instrument for investigating early language acquisition. It's a very simple tool and therefore easy to use. So in the study, in these tools, parents are given lists like the one on the right with words, and are asked to cross out the words that they have heard their child speak. And these studies have been conducted in in many languages, including Polish, I think. Unfortunately, I haven't had access to that data, but it'd be fun to get that at some point. So there are two tests in the MacArthur Bates CDI. Here we're using the words and sentences, which is normed for older children, that is between 16 and 36 months. There are also some slightly younger children in this sample, which I'll return to. So the sample that we're using is the same as I had plot from before, but this is now an updated sample with 26 languages available at the Stanford Word Bank. And in total, we included 39,553 children across these 26 languages. You can see the details of the samples here on the right. If you don't have time to read all of it, then you can also go to the preprint of this paper, which is in the link in the bottom right, but you can also just Google Wallentin and Trecker, and then you'll find it. So these data then cover the 12 to 36 months. We excluded participants where sex or / gender was not reported, and we can always discuss that. But the idea here is that the only way that we can actually know anything about sex / gender in these children is via the parental reports. So parents reporting on their phenotypic traits of their children. We, of course, don't know anything about gender identity because the children are too young to express these things at this point. And these things, the gender identity doesn't become something that is fixed probably until far later. Okay. One problem with this data is that although it's the same test, the words in each test differ. So they've been translated, and some languages leave out some words and take in new words. Therefore, it's not possible to sort of make one big analysis. So we've analyzed all these data on a language by language basis. Another problem is that some of these samples, like in the middle on the list on the right, you can see under K, you can see two African language, Kirigiyama and Kiswahili, and they only have 88 and 87 participants, which is too little to do any proper sex gender classification. We've included them anyway, as you'll see, but of course the results are not really trustworthy. So what did we do? Well, this is the boring slides with the methods. For each language, we converted all the words for each child into a vector of zeros if the child had not produced the word, and ones if the child had produced it. We then, for all the data in a particular language across all children, conducted a principal component analysis in order to do dimensionality reduction. And we took the first 25 components and used those in our analysis. We then downsampled the data to contain an equal number of boys and girls. This didn't mean a lot because there were roughly 50-50 already. So we didn't exclude many participants on this account. Then we divided the data into an 80-20% training and test set. And on the training set, we conducted classification analysis. We used logistic regression We did one on vocabulary, so the number of words produced, that's what people have done so far, and another on these 25 principal components that display variability in the kinds of words. And then we used the model to predict sex/gender in the last 20% of our sample. We repeated the classification with a couple of other machine learning methods and basically got the same results. So I'm reporting the logistic regression here. And here's the very busy slide with the results. So on each line here in the plot, you see a language. They're ordered according to sample size. Norwegian is the largest sample size, and you see the 2 African languages in the bottom. In the middle, there's a dotted line with 50% accuracy in classification, so that's our chance level. So everything that's to the right of this dotted line is means that we're classifying sex gender above average. The yellow brownish triangles are a classification based on language or vocabulary size, and the blue circles are classification based on vocabulary content. Hopefully you can see that in almost all languages, the blue circles are to the right of the yellow triangles. You can see marked with stars for each line whether we in individual languages were able to statistically, on a statistically significant level, predict sex gender based on these 2 analysis. And actually, we were only, although the on average, girls have larger vocabularies than boys, it's only in the largest samples that this becomes statistically significant in a classification analysis. Whereas almost all languages, apart from Italian, which is the strange exception to the rule here, we were able to classify sex gender on the basis of the kind of words that the children speak. So this is significant in 22 out of 26 languages. And in sample classification, so based on the 80%, we get an accuracy of 78% correct. And out of sample, so on data that the model has never seen, we average 74%. But the range is between 50% for the Italian and 87% for the best performing languages, which is Korean. We can see that both when we look at vocabulary size and vocabulary content, sample size matters. I apologize here, the colors have been exchanged. So now vocabulary content, so the kind of words is yellow, brownish, and the vocabulary size has become blue. But you can see that across the language samples, the larger sample size is predictive of better accuracy. So our assumption here is, apart from Italian, that if we have enough data, we actually become able to predict sex gender with approximately 80% across languages, which sort of comes close to what we saw in the Facebook paper. So already before the age of 3, the words that children use are different. So we can create a word cloud. So here I've done that for 4 of the languages. English, which is hopefully something that most people in the audience understand. Danish because I understand it, and Italian because I know that Joanna understands it. And one of the interesting things in the Italian word clouds is that although we're predicting with 50% accuracy, you still see a gender stereotypic distribution of the word. So the model actually is picking up on something, regardless of the fact that it's not useful in the out of sample classification. So that's a conundrum. Yeah. So of course, this is just qualitatively investigating these words, and we can see that it looks like there's a very gender stereotypic distribution with fire trucks and penises among the boys, and dresses, dolls, and vaginas in the girl words. The Stanford Word Bank has a semantic category variable that we use to look at what kinds of words are in these word clouds. So when we did that and used the predictiveness scores from each word that we were able to extract from our classification analysis, and see whether those are explained by these semantic categories that we didn't make ourselves, so they're limited to those that are in the samples. We find that that again, it's a very gender stereotypical pattern, where across all languages, regardless of sample size, vehicles are a male thing, and clothing is a girl thing. I'm sorry to say this is so stereotypical that it makes me sad, but it's just the way that these data are. So statistically significant categories are vehicles and outside places as being more boyish, and pronouns, games, animals, toys, connecting words, body parts, and clothing for girls. Yes. So whether you want to whether you find this fascinating or want to cry is up to you. But yeah, these are the data. So obviously, there's also a large variability. So we can plot the data, the vocabulary size for different ages across the different languages, and we can see that there is this huge variability. But what our analysis didn't say was whether our ability to predict sex gender is something that is present in early childhood, or whether it's something that just comes about at later stages. So we did the exact same analysis, but now in bins of 3 months, so that we could try to see when it is that we become able to classify sex gender. And in order to do so, we had to leave out the small samples. So here we have only included samples that have a sample size over 800 children. But what you can see here, eyeball, is that actually the blue line, which now again is the vocabulary content, is above the yellow line, which is vocabulary size, already from a very, very early stage. And if we use those classification or rather regression coefficients and put into an analysis across languages, we can see that our ability to classify follows a second order polynomial shape, so that it starts being low, and then it peaks around 30 months of age, and then it declines a little bit. But nevertheless, it is significantly better than vocabulary size, almost instantly from when we have these data. Remember that this test is normed for 16 months and older, so the younger children that we have are really saying very few words. So a reason why it's peaking earlier than the 36 months, which is the oldest children that we have, is probably that there are some limitations with this test. So when children become around 3 years old, their vocabulary grows exponentially, and many of the children will start to know and produce all the words in the word lists in the CDIs. So therefore, there's simply a ceiling effect, and what we might see as sex-gender differences now may become a matter of frequency of use rather than having used or not used at all. So this is why probably why we see a decline in the predictability in the later ages. That's at least our guess, not because the language use becomes less gendered. Right. Now that we've seen that we can predict sex/gender with 80% accuracy, this, of course, can be interpreted like a much larger effect than what we've seen in the large effect sizes in the beginning. But you also have to acknowledge that this leaves 20% of the children which are either not classifiable or misclassified. So there's plenty of room for people, children being non-binary or transgender in the sample. And also there's the possibility that different cultures may display different distributions of gendered. So what this analysis allows us to do is to put, rather than to classify children as either or, we can each child actually has this probability of being one or the other, and that's what I've plotted here on the right. And you can see that these distributions overlap more or less. If you look at the Italian, which is on the third row from the bottom, you see a complete overlap in distributions. We simply cannot tell them apart. But if you look at the larger samples up in the top row, you see a very, very clear distribution. But more interestingly, we see bimodal distributions in some of the samples as well. So there's more than one peak. So for example, Turkish and Mandarin, there seems to be both children that are strongly sex-gendered and children that are not at all. So this may or may not be a cultural thing, or it may have to do with the test words that are in the samples, or with the parents that are reporting on these children. So this is something, of course, we also have to acknowledge, that the biases of the parents may also be included in these data. So it's the parents that are reporting on their children, and if they are more attentive to gendered words, then that will show up in these tests as well. However, when you compare the MacArthur-Bates CDI with other tests of vocabulary, they tend to correlate very well. So we assume that these data are not too biased. good. The discussion then is that we find strong effects. They're replicable across diverse cultures, European, Asian, and American. So this is very difficult to explain why it's there. So one explanation could have been that it's sort of a Indo-European language, for example, but that seems not to be the case because these effects are there across the different language families. Yeah, they depend on sample size, but they seem to be robust even with smaller sample sizes. But they also depend on the words in the test, of course, making it difficult to compare. So it would be very, very interesting to have identical word lists to the extent that that's possible across languages to actually compare cultures. Yeah, I already said that the data are based on parental reports. So some of the effects may be due to biases in reporting rather than real sex gender differences. Yeah, but if that's the case, then it reveals that that language is a window into the mind of the speakers, and of course also into their life world in general. So that this is why it's impossible to distinguish between sex and gender, because our life world is gendered from the get-go in early infancy. Clothing, parents use clothing to display to strangers the gender of their child, and thus it may not be so surprising that if a lot of clothing items are gendered and even female gendered, that girls get to speak words earlier that have to do with gendered clothing. To sum up, vocabulary content predicted sex and gender in almost all languages sampled with sufficient sample sizes, Italian being the exception. Accuracy increased with sample size. In the largest samples, accuracy reached levels like those achieved with adult language samples. So it seems to be the case that our linguistic world is gendered from the very earliest of measurable time points. Accuracy increased with age, peaking around 30 months. Semantic categories that differed were clothing and vehicles, and these results can be biased by many things, but given that they're so robust across tests and languages, we tend to think that there's probably some kind of semi-robust yeah, I want to say I don't want to say universal, but it's going towards something which is universal, whether that means biologic or universally cultural. We can't really tell. I have to acknowledge Fabio, who knows about the child tests and the language acquisition in general. I just stumbled upon these data and did the analysis, and then Fabio helped me with actually understanding them and writing the paper. And thanks to you, and of course thanks to the Stanford Word Bank for making these data available. That was it.
Mikkel, thank you so much. This was really so. I mean, of course, we are shocked, but also impressed how incredibly elegant this work is. And just a short question: maybe I missed this, but probably everybody here has this question. Is MacArthur-Bates test gendered based on the sort of, you know, the composition, content composition of the words? Can we assess it in some way?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. So what does it mean that it's gendered? So obviously, what I've just showed you is that it displays effects of gender, sex, and gender. I think the words have been chosen to be the most frequently spoken in early language acquisition, and but also to cover a range of semantic categories. And of course, whether these words are representative of anything is this is really important question, and in a sense impossible to answer unless you've measured every single word in terms of frequency. And so they were, to my knowledge, developed in order to make something which was representative of language acquisition based on earlier research. But I'm not an expert in these. So of course you could make a test which is made so that it will not show gender differences. But what would that then be? So this I don't think there's an objective answer to what is such a test here should contain, which words it should contain.
Yes, but that would be really interesting to check. And Grzegorz and Carolina.
Yeah. It was extremely interesting and very elegant, as Joanna has just said. First of all, I wanted to say I'm sorry we couldn't use our Polish data, which we haven't regrettably submitted to World Bank yet, but the data are there if you'd like to have a look at them at some point. And also, I was just wondering, because we have developed adaptive versions of CDI as well, which we are now gathering some data for. Adaptive meaning that the parent doesn't get the whole list of items, but the items are chosen for them dynamically based on the responses to previous items. And I was just wondering whether those data could be used in some way to differentiate sex/gender. Do you think we might expect differences in terms of items which are administered to parents of children based on the gender?
Well, so again, I guess it's similar to Joanna's question. So you can devise a word list that shows no gender differences, and you can devise one that shows very large gender differences. So again, so the naive thought that I had when I went into this, and of course I haven't checked it, was that these words were chosen to sort of represent the life world of children, so that there are no words that are left out. Of course, a reviewer actually of this paper has asked a similar question, and what one could do is, and that has been done a little bit, is to look at something like the Childless repository to see what words are spoken to children and what they speak themselves, and see whether that fits with the words that are in these word lists. But still, then the question is that a representative sample? And I think it's very, very difficult to come up with what representative means. I think the in machine learning, the take has been to simply just increase the samples until the language models now read all the text that's available in the world, more or less. But even that is not represented necessarily because it's written by texts that are written by people that are writers, and they're not necessarily representative of those that are not writers. So yeah, this is a true conundrum. But I think when you select the words for a smaller sample, I guess it would be a good idea to take these measures into account, depending on what your aim is with the tests.
The aim is to measure the language development as accurately as possible. As for the Joanna's question and the representativeness of the whole list of words, CDIs are inventories, which means that they are supposed to be as comprehensive as possible. So the way items have been chosen for CDIs, there wasn't much psychometric work in that respect. That's just something I wanted to add. Also, I'm afraid I will have to leave shortly because I'm supposed to be teaching right now. My students are waiting in class, so just to excuse myself.
And I would like to say that I was now joined from my own computer.
Okay, very, very well. So we have space for other questions.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I can't find the hand raising one. Wonderful talk, as everyone is saying, really nice overview of everything. So I have one comment and two questions. So I heard you say, talking about the newer research you have done with all the gender differences in terms of the types of words they're using, and you were almost apologizing for finding these differences, that maybe it might make some people cry. And I only started just reading a book by a biologist, specifically a primatologist, that looks at gender differences in human-like monkeys. And he also finds that people very often respond emotionally when they find differences. And what they're trying to say is, but we are just describing the behavior without making judgment if it is a good or a bad thing. And then the next thing is to ask the question, so where do those differences come from? So I would suggest not to apologize for what you're finding and just like saying that you can describe it. And then I have two questions. So one of them is about the in the paper that was sent around from you. You are making differences between whether it's a biological difference or whether it's cultural difference, and you're suggesting that if it's a cultural difference, that you would find it universally. But that really surprised me because normally if it's a cultural difference, it depends on the culture you're in. So you see that in Asian countries, the verbs are spoken earlier by children, and it's more noun oriented, for example, in Western countries. So I was wondering if you have done some more research in being able to disentangle whether these are cultural differences or brain differences, because we also know that they are kind of interacting, right? When we're learning language, the abilities you have to learn a language. And then the second question, I don't know if you know, but I heard Joanna say that you have done a lot of brain research. So I'm curious about the lateralization. In bilingualism, they're still speaking a lot about this. So whether it's more lateralized or non-lateralized. So I understand there are no differences between genders, but I was curious if in terms of bilingualism, they're still speaking about this, because there I just heard a story, it might be more lateralized due to general cognitive functions instead of language itself. So a bit long question, but I hope it's still clear. Otherwise, I can explain again.
Yeah. So the first question was about the distinctions I try to make in the paper about how to recognize whether something is a sex difference, or whether it's a cultural difference. And I hope that I didn't write that if it's universal, that was would be a sign that it's a cultural difference. I hope that I wrote the opposite, but I may be mistaken.
No,
So,
I will double check again.
But one of the things that I know that I write in that paper is that if it's an evolved trait that has an evolved reason for being there, then you would expect it to show a more categorical effect size. So I use the voice pitch as an example in the papers where you can predict sex with more or less 100% accuracy, because it's we also know that it's governed by testosterone, the breaking of the male voice, and so there must be some sort of it's a natural phenomenon, you could say. Whereas most of the other things related to language, although there are these wild narratives about differences in distribution of labor among prehistoric people that would may or may not have caused differences in language competence and to arise. I think they're just stories, basically. There are also people who've claimed that language and cognition in general may be involved in sexual selection, so that, for example, the language could be sort of the human version of the peacock feathers that we see show very distinct sex differences. But that would usually predict that it's the male that has the strongest capabilities, which is definitely not the case. So I think we can rule out more or less that there are strong evolutionary differences apart from these things that have to do with voice pitch. But of course, there may be interactions between sex and gender, and that's of course hugely interesting, but also very difficult to investigate.
Yeah, where it comes from, indeed. So then let me leave you with the fact that this primatologist was also saying that if they give to I believe these were the chimpanzees, if they give them like toys with wheels or dolls, that actually there is a difference between what the girls or the boys will play with, but this is mainly by the fact that boys are not interested in the dolls. That's what mainly explains that difference. So just a thought for potentially where things are coming from, but I'm not sure either yet.
So our results, they mirror also the results found by studies on non-verbal behavior in children. So in that sense, and that's I guess the way it should be, that language is a reflection of the life world and the minds of the speaker.
Exactly.
So it would be very strange if children that played with fire trucks didn't also learn the word for fire truck.
Yeah.
You were mentioning lateralization, and I must admit I haven't studied lateralization with bilinguals, so I'm not really able to answer that. But
in one language, are they still talking that language is lateralized or not?
So languages are in the same hemisphere usually. It's not. So there are very few anecdotal. There's a little anecdotal evidence that stroke or surgery, that they will lose the ability to speak one of their languages but not the other, suggesting that it could be the case that they're located different places in the brain, but it's never the case that that you sort of have a perfectly spared language in one hemisphere and another in the other.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to say that language is a reflection, but also is the environment as well. Right?
It's the tool as well, yes, of course.
It creates also the environment and differences in the environment. Carolina, before you, Claudia had a question that she typed. Claudia, would you like to? Are you able to ask this question? Or?
Yeah, I didn't want to intrude, and then I feared I would have forgotten that. so that's why. So that's very brief. It's maybe it's more of curiosity. So I was wondering. First of all, thanks. That was very, very interesting. And I was wondering whether you think, because I remember that some of the data sets that are included in the World Bank are quite old. I mean, like for example, the Italian one, which also seemed to be one of your preoccupations in the data set. It's from the 90s, mid 90s or something like that. So, and I know that today there's an increasing pressure also in parenting without gendering so much, you know, trying to use, I don't know, gender neutral toys or stuff like that, especially in the first years of development. So I was just wondering what were your thoughts on that. So whether you think that these results might replicate even when taking into account more contemporary data sets or not. So it's just a curiosity. It's
Yeah, it's a very, very, very good question, and I've been wondering it myself. And so, of course, I don't know, but so most of these data are more than 10 years old. So, how things will look now or 10 years from now, nobody knows. But it's a very, very interesting question.
Thanks. Yeah.
But are there such for some of the languages, at least, do you have longitudinal, in a sense, longitudinal, not really, but the data with subsets from, I don't know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and now that you can analyze with now you have a pipeline, so it would be very probably easy to see.
Yeah, so Fabio is working on some longitudinal data so that we can also try to see within the individual children when things occur. But I don't know if they're dated so that we know when in time they were collected.
Yeah, I meant
usually these data collections are done in batches so that you publish you can get your things published. But yeah, so I must admit I don't know what the state of affairs with CDIs are these days. I just analyze these data.
It would be really interesting to see if anything is changing, really. Carolina?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It really got me thinking and asking myself questions. So now I have a few questions, and I think to at least one of them, I should know the answer, but I don't. So I will ask you. The thing is that I suppose that a lot of these results are reflected in the parental input. What parents say to their children, maybe that they tend to label specific objects to girls, so the clothes, etc., and maybe they tend to label vehicles more to boys. So I guess that's something to consider as well, maybe. And the question is, maybe do you know of any kind of research or studies that would actually look for these differences, sex/gender differences, in the parental input exactly?
Yeah, I know. So thank you. And you're right. This is completely circular in the sense that obviously if the children are saying particular words, it's because they heard somebody else say them. And so it's not as if there's some biological system in the brains of children that allows them to learn particular words and not others. It's because it's in their environment. And of course, who creates that environment? Well, obviously the parents to a large degree, and then perhaps also the children themselves. So one I find very telling effect is the differences in names for genitals. Obviously, girls are in an environment where there are particular genitals, and boys are in an environment where there are more of another particular genital. And obviously that will allow them to interact with the words for these genitals to a larger degree. And that sort of says it all, that here the child is actually both also producing the environment. But of course the parents are doing the same.
Thank you. And can I have
I wanted to address the other part of the question, which was that a reviewer made me aware that there is a conference proceeding where they've looked into the words spoken by parents in the childless repository, and correlated it with the gender differences in the American version of the MacArthur-Bates CDI, and they find a weak correlation. So you can also actually find it in data that that's the case. So that's good. I have yet to update the preprint with the discussion where I've included this paper now, but it will happen very soon, so that you can find the reference there. I can't remember the names.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Can I have another question? Just a very quick one. It's about the type of word, because as what I remember is that clothes are more for kind of girl specific and vehicles more boy specific. What about verbs? I think I saw them at some point, but I didn't pay that much attention at that point, sorry. I guess that verbs do not go either way. Not really, no. Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I find, in these classes, they don't really, there is a bit of a mixture of semantic classes, and then there are a few grammatical classes as well, but it's not really well structured. But I find that the most interesting is the pronouns that I'm hoping to look more into, because I happen to be interested in pragmatics as well, and of course the closed class words are strongly related to that. And they tend, for some reason, it's a weak effect, but there's a female advantage in the use of pronouns, and this may simply be the vocabulary size that's kicking through, but it might be interesting to see whether there's underneath that label are differences in sociality, for example, that the kinds of pronouns that children use. But there's to answer your question, I don't think there's any reason to think that verbs are particularly gendered.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And here, Eva also has a question.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about the toys, vehicles, and clothing, because actually when I read the paper, one thing that occurred to me was that like vehicles are most likely the toys for the boys, right? So you have the cars and you try to play with it. And so the words, instead to like go into the category of toys, go to a different category. And most likely that with the clothing, it can be the same. Like, for example, the girl has a doll, which would be classified as a toy, but the doll's clothing would be like a different category right here. So I wonder, like, I know we are measuring something else, like we are trying to find the words and not their meanings, but maybe we should also like try to check the meanings or context in which we use them, at least based on these results, because like maybe it's also helpful in the longer perspective, just like also with one of those word clouds, you have, for example, lots of garbage related words for boys. So it was very interesting. So maybe this is something that made me think. It's not really a question, but do you have any ideas to that?
Thanks for the comments. And of course, you're completely right that that words, these, I'm in a sense very happy that I didn't have to make these semantic categories, because I wouldn't really know how to. Because you're obviously right that the vehicles are probably also toys, and so the I'm trying to say as little as I can about what this means, apart from the fact that it seems to be a very clear pattern, and that obviously there's no evolutionary reason why boys should have a module for vehicles. This makes absolutely no sense. So the interpretation is open, and there's plenty of work to be done with this, and potentially more sensible analysis of this, and also contextualized. Obviously, this is not possible with this data set, though. But that maybe your project may be able to enlighten us on that.
Yes, but actually this research is really also, you know, also your discussion about the differences was really very, very important for us. And if you are talking about verbs and nouns, and I was thinking if I could choose one, I don't know, characteristic of language that I would be very interested if it differs, would be some kind of illocutory actions. And I know that there has been work on the types of, I don't know, imperatives and descriptives and so on, directed to a child, and more directed to a child, I think, than produced. Do you know of any work like that?
We cite one paper in the article that says something about how parents speak differently to their children, but it's not. I must say it's not my area of expertise. So it's primarily Fabio who you should direct those questions to.
Okay, I'm looking here at Carolina and Magda. Maybe you know something, but about the speech acts, let's say, right? Categorization. I know that you were doing, Carolina, some work on mentalization and mental words.
Yes, but to be honest, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer your question, which is exactly why I think that this talk really got me thinking about this.
Yeah, so I think there's so the inflections of words, for example, is not covered in this test. But that would be very interesting. But I guess that parents are not necessarily very good at reporting on the use of grammar in their children.
That's true, but I think that the more naturalistic data we have, like, you know, the kind of De Bruy's data recording your child all day long, and Lina, which is also another system for capturing data in naturalistic settings. This is something that we probably would also get rid of your bias, reporting bias, and probably more and more data like that in databases. I don't know. You guys know better.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I did some studies with Agnieszka Pluta on mental state talk in parents, and we recorded conversations between parents and children, but we didn't look at gender differences. And I guess in psychology, especially when you study children, you don't really look into gender that much because we tend to focus on other things and maybe not always see the point of looking into gender since we focus on very small children. But I think it's very interesting. It was also very fascinating for me to listen to. And we are also doing work with CDIs. So this is very, very interesting. So thank you for highlighting this.
Thank you.
Great. So last question, which is, you sort of said that you don't have a clue why is it like that, but what's going on with this Italian? What is it? And Claudia said that this is probably data from the 90s, so probably, I don't know if more or less gendered than now, but it's really very, very interesting, this distribution. It was fascinating. Any clues? I think Fabio is Italian, right?
Yeah, he's Italian, so and he hasn't got a clue. So I guess that if he doesn't, then I will definitely not venture into any speculations on why we don't see anything.
Super interesting, and I wonder if it has to do maybe. Could have something to do with even the construction of the testing. I don't know. I have no idea.
But
okay.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
If I remember correctly, also the Italian sample was not that big of a sample, or maybe
700 and something. So it's not big, but it's big enough to show effects. I would let me just find. Here we have it. 752. So it should be big enough to show an effect if there was one.
Especially the contrast with French, which is exactly the same. It's just and it's from the same language group. It's fascinating. Yeah. Really. Now you have on top of the Danish puzzle of children learning a little bit later the language. Now you have an Italian puzzle as well.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you so much. I don't know if there are any more questions. If not, I will just I hope that Grzegorz, Karolina, Magda Karinka also can be in touch with you, because definitely this data, I don't know, Karolina, how feasible it is that Mikkel can get his hands on the Polish sample.
Very, very feasible. I think that we are very close to uploading it to World Bank, like very, very close. I know that it's just it's something that is still on the to-do list. So yes, definitely I think that we could stay in touch with Mikkel and talk about this. Yes, if you're interested in including the Polish data set into these analysis.
Definitely, the more the merrier. And yeah, so my main interests are in semantics and in pragmatics. So this overlap where we suddenly see personality is another thing that you could argue is something that is being displayed here to some extent. That's at least a hypothesis that we display who we are by the words that we say, and this is what fascinates me, not only with this data, but across the board, regardless of whether it's gender or other types of personality traits. So by all means, do contact me if you have any ideas or data or questions or comments in that regard.
So I think linking to this with bilingualism is also interesting, because there are people that say they feel different depending on the language they speak. So they could be far more formal in speaking one of their Chinese languages than in English. So it definitely would relate as well.
Yeah. And of course, with modern technology, if one could just record everything that everybody ever said at all times and upload it.
I guess we need
to
Google because I'm sure they record.
Yeah, Google knows already. And of course, it's also a dystopian view to some extent. I'm happy that my children were not recorded throughout their formative years. Yeah.
Yes, and I know that people are working, especially on sort of a fingerprint identification of a person by the words spoken by this person, by the language spoken by this person. I know that in Łódź, for example, Piotr Pęzik is working with the Clarin PL group. And it's amazing that it's actually quite feasible, even on the basis of not such a long text or speech, which is kind of terrifying. How this personality might
exactly.
Really, identity might show up. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So the Facebook data that I was displaying, they've also on the same data set done analysis on personality and mental disorders, and one can predict everything from what we do online.
It sort of makes you even more scary with this prospect of generating texts artificially and making them act on us as environment without subjecting them to experience while producing them, right? When you generate them artificially, it's not sieved through, it's not filtered through your experience and anybody's experience, actually. And it's sort of making me always uneasy. And I'm really, really happy that this discussion also opened up at the end. So it remains for me to say that we are definitely hoping for you to stay longer in touch with us, Mikkel, and not only via sending the data, but also being with us for the next talks, which are more or less about always about this, how our activities are mediated through language and other systems, other formal systems, also up to algorithms. So let's meet again, and let's thank again Mikkel. Bravo, really.
Thank you.